We're fortunate to have a panel of speakers who have different vantage points on the experience of crossing over into the adult world. I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker, who's Dr. Anthony Antosh. Dr. Antosh is Professor of Special Education and Founding Director of the Paul V. Sherlock Center on Disabilities at Rhode Island College. He will speak with us about comprehensive transition planning. Dr. Antosh.
Thank you. I never know quite where to put stuff down with these things. Let me get the key. Okay. I'm here actually representing both the AUCD, which I think most of you know is a network of about 100 universities, centers across the country, as well as representing my own center and the work that we have done. Within the broader topic of the briefing today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on students who have significant important needs. And more or less, I have been tasked with doing three things. One, to give a very, 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 very brief intro into where transition comes from, to talk about a report that AUCD did about 2 years ago, I guess, and then to really sort of give an example of how that report has played out with practices in my own state. So those will be my agenda for my time. When you look at where transition came from, obviously we have to go back to the first special ed law in 1975, which essentially laid out the concept that beginning at about age 14 or 16, depending upon your state regs, you need to begin to plan for transition to adult life. When you look across all the federal agencies, there are significant transition initiatives that have been in play for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Two of the ones that I would probably most significantly point out are the transition to post-secondary programs, and I have a slide on that because the research on the integrated post-secondary ed programs is that it's a major strategy for both increasing employment options as well as just broadening the options that adolescents have. And then the Promise grants of 2 years ago are intriguing in that what they do is that they require lots of agencies in a state to develop an integrated plan for moving kids off SSA into a more integrated, more independent entity. And then obviously, without belaboring the point, the WIOA of last year really has radically changed what transition will look like, integrates, talks about the pre-transition services that have to be there, requires the voc rehab agencies to devote 15% of their state budget to transition. So all of these things, if you will, over the last multiple years have really shaped what transition looks like. About 5 years ago, AUCD decided to focus its network on trying to make transition more of a national and more of a pragmatic focus. We gathered information from about 40 different states. And fundamentally what I would tell you is that if I had to summarize what we found is that there's a huge gap between the expectation, which is that youth would have an integrated, self-determined transition process. But what we found is that by far and large that didn't happen because among state agencies there was very little coordination and collaboration. So we developed this monograph. There are some sample copies of it on the table outside. And we also developed a user-friendly version of this, which has been used in about 15 different states as sort of a transition planning guide. Both this monograph and the user-friendly version are available from the AUCD website, so I would encourage you to go there. What we fundamentally found is that the reason there was such a gap is that the world really didn't approach transition from a self-determination standpoint. And self-determination, as you all know, is the process whereby youth learn to set goals, to problem solve those goals, and then to act on those goals. By far and large, what we found is that rather than a self-determined transition process, transition was largely determined by other people, by agencies, not by the youth themselves. We found that most agencies really didn't think about culture at all. The National Center on Cultural Competence at Georgetown has several tools that help one recognize what culture is and how you kind of make your transition program much more culturally competent. We also found that disciplines and services really tend to function in very much of a silo kind of way, and there was significantly less integration than people wanted there to be. And then by far and large, people thought of transition as one thing, maybe two things, and did not recognize the breadth of things that needed to be part of the transition process in some form. So what our monograph advocates for is that self-determination is the foundation and ultimate outcome. Youth, as they transition into adulthood, ought to be able to set their own goals and problem solve and figure out how to achieve those. You've got to think about transition in a multiple perspective kind of way. You've got to understand that every family has culture. You've got to be respectful of that, because that culture will greatly influence what transition looks like for each individual. And then we really have to sort of encourage and find strategies that will make all of the agencies and all of the disciplines involved function in a more integrated kind of way. This is just sort of one visualization of that. We're rooted in culture. You think about everything, you define and measure what the outcomes are, but ultimately your goal is to really develop a self-determined life. This is another visualization of that essentially says you need to think about the characteristics and support needs that the person has and integrate those with what the system is able to provide, but not just around one domain or one thing, but around all things. And the questions in the middle of this, which I know you can't read, are essentially talk about where do I live, who do I live with, what do I do for fun, what job would I want to do, should college be an option for me? All of those things are laid out, and transition in our mind should really address all of those in some form. Just to really quickly provide some data that indicates the gaps that I referred to before. Lots of family surveys have indicated that families' expectations tend to be high, but oftentimes the system fails. Families, and when you summarize all of the requests and all of the needs that families have, the need for information is probably the number one thing that families have said over and over and over again. If you look at it from an employment standpoint, roughly across all disability groups, the percentage of people who are engaged in the workforce is about 20%, and it's been about 20% for about 50 years. So even though lots of us would say we know how to promote employment, we seem to not be able to get what we know into practice. This is the post-secondary ed options that I talked about before. There are currently in the country 27 of those TIPSID-funded projects, but there really are about 200 colleges, universities nationwide that are implementing an integrated program of some kind. And when you look at the outcomes of those, they are already in their third year of the TIPSIDs, are able to document increases in social networks, increases in academic performance, and increases in the number of people who are transitioning into employment as well. When you look at where people live, and you look at the public funding for community housing, ballpark 70% live in either their own home or their family member's home. That's where really most of the emphasis has been, but more than half the family members interviewed will tell you very simply that they think people should live in a much more independent setting. When you look at how people spend their time, they spend less than 1% of their time with people who are somebody other than their immediate network or people they live with or work with. Transportation is a huge problem. People are allowed to make decisions about some things, but not about most things. And so therefore the whole self-determination decision-making thing becomes a really critical part of the whole. So ballpark our pitch, very simply, is that if you're going to think about transition in a meaningful kind of way and develop practices that are going to make transition meaningful, you need to make sure that it's integrated, that it's culturally competent, that it's rooted in self-determination, and that it thinks about everything. Real quickly, we are under, in my state, a consent decree. The Department of Justice investigated us for about 2 years, and without reading you the 8,000-page findings letter, 2 big points. One, they found that the state essentially failed to provide the resources that allowed people to choose to be in integrated settings. And because the resources weren't there, people ended up in segregated settings. And one of the prime statistics of that is that when you look across youth with autism and youth with DD, only 5% of those youth transitioned over the last 3 years into any kind of an integrated employment sort of thing. So the consent decree, which was signed about a year and a month ago actually, really laid out all kinds of things that the state needs to do. What we are trying to do, based upon several studies, is we're working with 90% of the school districts in the state to make transition not just a form that you fill out, but to really make transition meaningful and real. And so there are lots of research, just 2 studies real quickly here that sort of highlight the value of paid work experiences, the value of social skills, and the value that family expectations have. There's also tons of research about the role that self-determination plays. It's one of the primary predictors of lots of post-school outcomes. So we have designed this 3-part program in which we're reaching every family in the state, we're teaching every teacher in the state, and we're providing every student in the state with a variety of employment experiences with the goals of increasing expectations, increasing self-determination, and increasing those things that have been proven to lead to integrated employment and good post-school outcomes. So the proverbial bottom line is that the gap that we have found is that we know what to do, but we don't do it. And so what we're trying to promote, both at the national level and the state level, is the doing of the things that we know work. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Antosh. I was jotting down a few notes as you were speaking. I think we'll have some time for questions at the end when all of our speakers have presented.